Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Mark. How lovely to be together on this last day of October, celebrating enthusiasm and the change of seasons. This morning we'll be exploring, as Mark's opening prayer invited us to, and we'll be exploring the real us, as Jackie's music encouraged us to. As we drop the disguises, the masks, we get in touch with the real part of us. So I'm going to defer any Halloween jokes until fellowship. You're welcome to share those with us. What I would like each of us to do for a moment is to take this word that is in the particular translation of Scripture this morning that I'll be using. And the word is, whatever comes up for you around it, the word is husbandry. Husbandry. And our scripture is taken from the book of John, verses 1 through 12. And this is the master speaking. I am the true vine, and my Father is the husbandman. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he cuts off. And the one which bears fruit, he prunes, so that it may bring forth more fruit. You have already been pruned because of the word which I have spoken to you. Remain with me, and I with you. Just as a branch cannot give fruit by itself unless it remains in the vine, even so you cannot unless you remain with me. I am the vine, you are the branches. He who remains with me and I with him will bear abundant fruit, for without me you can do nothing. Unless a man remains with me, he will be like a branch which is cast off, withered, which they pick up and throw into the fire to be burned. If you remain with me and my words remain with you, whatever you ask shall be done for you. In this, the Father will be glorified, that you bear abundant fruit and be my disciples. Just as my Father has loved me, I also have loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, even as I have kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. I have spoken these things to you, that my joy may be in you and that your joy may be full. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. Elsewhere, we read, love your neighbor as yourself. And it's important to notice this morning that a neighbor can be a thought that we hold in mind. Sometimes those neighbors can be the most of a blessing or not. In preparing the materials this week for the second part of bringing life to all of our relationships, I was reminded of a young Black woman who left Mississippi for work in Detroit when she was just 15, having come from an impoverished background and coming north where there was less persecution. In my ministerial training, it was really powerful for me, and I've shared this with everyone before, compared to the very complex ways of the intellect which had informed my thinking and my writing. The person that I spoke of just a moment ago is Reverend Ruth Mosley, who began Unity as a ministry in urban Detroit. It's amazing to me how her 3-part instruction for sharing a message or a lesson on Sunday morning will sometimes come back to me so naturally, so simply and purely, and immediately does away with the ego that shows up for me as temptation to overdo it. And Reverend Ruth would look for 3 things in our Sunday lessons. She would say, share with people what it is that you're talking about. Pretty simple, right? What is it? She would say. Secondly, share with them how it works. Finally, tell them how you've applied it in your own life. And so this morning we're talking about the real self. This morning we're talking about bringing life to our relationships. And so in the sincere hope of adhering to it, as I always do at the beginning of every lesson I've ever taught in my life, I will share with you the outline for this morning's 15 or 20 minute message. I'll do a brief link or connection between the husbandman who shows up in our scripture and look at a couple of those metaphysical messages that really help with bringing life to our relationships. So we'll look at the metaphysics of that scripture. Then I would like to just revisit some key concepts very briefly from last week, and then introduce how we practically applied those last week compared to what has helped me apply them in a new way this week. Well, new, that is to say, in the context of this week and this lesson. And then the last 10 minutes, we will look at some of the new concepts from Dr. Jenny Brown's work, Growing Yourself Up. So last week, to begin, we talked about bringing life to all of our relationships, and we talked about the primary relationship being the one that we are nurturing on an ongoing basis with God in us. Number 1, relationship. Second, our relationship with ourselves. And thirdly, our relationship with all others. Do you know that oftentimes it's important to check in on a regular basis to see whether that particular priority of relationships is still at work in our consciousness? Do we put God first? How well are we doing at putting ourselves first in a mature way? And so bringing life to our relationships is really bringing these qualities of God, the quality of the life that lives us, and the degree to which we are able to release the small self, our humanhood, to relinquish whatever you want to call it. I call it the ego. It's the small self. It's the shadow. And isn't it interesting that that part of us seems to get most activated in the relationships that we say we treasure the most? And so what are those qualities of God that live in us and through us and that flow from us when we show up as grown-ups in our relationship? All of the relationships, including the one that we define as ours with God. Those qualities include love, changelessness, power that is spiritual and not human power, and light. You know, when we stop to think about the showing up of the small self in our primary relationships, perhaps you react the way I know I used to and think how counterintuitive that was, how illogical it would be that I would not naturally bring my best self my God life to the relationships I treasure. And yet, closer examination of those relationships, which we did last week in an honest, authentic way, a closer examination quickly revealed to me that, in fact, those patterns that show up in us, that reveal to us that we are, in fact, patterned in our relational expressions, are simply chosen from fear rather than love. And so for me, that's a great gauge of how I'm showing up as a mature, individuated, differentiated grown-up, which we'll be looking at a bit more in a moment. So last Sunday, we just briefly explored awakening, and I shared with you how this work, growing yourself up for the last 4 years or so, has been a critical first step in my shifting away from immaturity, stagnation, and stuntedness in how I relate to the people that I say I love. And so, as always in spiritual growth, the first step is awareness. If I can't recognize what my repeated, futile, patterned way of showing up is, then how will I ever choose a different, more mature, or a healthier way to show up in my primary relationships? So part of what we looked at last week is that besides having this small self of us show up on its white horse of entitlement or righteousness, where it should be most in abeyance, the other thing that we notice is that certain relationships, frankly, just can seem to really just do us in. And we end up, as a result of not being individuated strong in our maturity, we end up either losing ourselves or we feel burnt out from repeated, useless attempts to make things right, okay, or better for others. I notice that it is in my most valued relationships that I can experience both the best and the worst of myself, frankly. So it is that I bring heightened consciousness, greater awareness to this. And so here are the key concepts from last week. I started with the fact that it mattered to me a lot that the author, Jenny Brown, Dr. Brown, says that for her, a primary relationship has to be with God. And so in our context this morning, we recognize God as the very life that is breathing us. And we turn to this life first to experience it as love that flows through us and for us. It is a power, an energy that characterizes first my relationship with the source from whence it springs, and then to be open, receptive, responsive, and obedient to accepting that love of myself. It is through total love and acceptance of self that same quality of purity and love can define how I show up in relationships. So once we tell ourselves the truth that we have aspects of our personalities, of our human selves that are immature, that are a loveless child driving the bus, that are self-entitled, and we choose to commit to strengthening instead and healing that part of us that may be stunted, then this can only happen, in my experience anyway, it's happened because I have made a conscious, deliberate decision to balance my thinking with my feeling and just really, really noticing when one of them is over functioning or out of control. And you will know how your small self most gets you off the track of mature responding. You will know whether you default into, being flooded by emotions, or protect yourself through the intellect. So then we talked about deciding what we value in our lives and noticing that maturity, integrity, and resilience, all aspects of growing ourselves up, maturity, resilience, and authenticity, grow to the degree that the things we say we value are reflected and truly and consistently reflected in how we love ourselves and how we then can fully love others. Last week, we talked about recognizing the interconnectedness that actually binds us to others, recognizing, oh, that's right, I am that person. And to show up in those moments when we are highly emotional and when we have lost temporarily access to the frontal lobe or to our thinking nature, then it is a matter of training to access calmer ways of showing up. The breath we talked about is always a calming technique. When we can breathe and pause, then we settle into the conflict. If there's conflict, in the field, if there's what the ego would consider a threat in the field, instead of engaging at that level, we rise above it and get comfortable with the discomfort. And trust me, this takes practice. Settling into the conflict in a way, opening to say, okay, here it comes, and I want to show up differently this time. So this activity in mind, last week we called self-regulation. How am I doing at self-regulating those impulses that, if not checked, through tolerating discomfort, deciding to stay with it, to just be with the anxiety of it or the agitation. And so that's what we looked at last week, ways that we get triggered, ways that we do not show up in a balanced way to love everyone in our space. Yesterday marked the second anniversary of the death of a dear friend of mine who really wore herself out taking care of her brother, who's been ill for about 12 years. So yesterday, we celebrated her life for a few moments, and it was very interesting to me that with him and his daughter in the room, the energy of pure love and acceptance was palpable. And the daughter's little dog has always been very reactive toward me for years. Yesterday, for the first time, her name is Harpo. She came into the room and she did a series of circles around me. And I said, oh my goodness, is she going to get dizzy? And Karen said, oh no, that's her way of saying, you belong here. You're okay. You're in our circle. And I thought, what a wonderful manifestation of accessing the power of love from within and showing up purely with that. And so how do I show up in a more mature, calm, self-regulated way? It's a decision. It's a choice to stay calm, to have ease. Here are the 3 steps that they were kind of like mile markers. How comfortable am I in the presence of someone who has a very different opinion from mine? And can I stay in the conversation? Secondly, in those moments when I get reactive, my older brother decided to send me a text yesterday, which let me know what his expectations will be of me going forward, which I found very entertaining. And frankly, I was glad to check in with myself and notice that, whereas that might have triggered me in the past, I did not give myself up in that moment, was not triggered, and that's what we're doing. We practice, to return for a moment to the metaphor or the imagery of our scripture. The vine is the Christ. The husbandman is the source. And so if the vine issues from the husbandry or husbandman, then we, by connecting with the vine and being a living, loving branch of the Christhood, then we can express love. When I can express my acceptance, my listening, my hearing, my loving from a position of confidence and clarity and great ease, then I'm accessing the husbandry, the husband in charge of the vineyard. And then I will no longer look for allies. That's the one trick of the ego. Let me see who I can get in my camp to prop up my position. Then I will no longer find that in maturing myself, I can look back and see what my positions used to be. But from moving into relationship connected to the power within me, the greatest ally, which is the Father, which is the Creator, which is the source of life, then a shift can happen and I can have ease of being, stating my position derived from my values, which might be different from yours. Now, we just touched briefly last week on how we have to be prepared for what happens once we really practice this, bringing our values, acceptance, and ease of being to relationships. It can cause havoc. Frankly, it can upset people who have been so used to our pattern way of relating that it throws them off so much that they may even feel challenged to ask you to please get back in the box. They cannot tolerate this different approach. And so then the time comes for us to say, wow, so I showed up differently. I showed up vulnerably. I showed up willing to own my position with confidence, informed by my values. And now I have to say, wow, how much ease of being can I tolerate when it's making the other person a mess, a complete mess? How can my new way of relating, while it's destabilizing the energy between people I've been in relationship with for a long time, how can I breathe, calm myself, count to 3, and come back and stay present with what looks like it could become conflict? Anybody else averse to conflict in the past? That was a huge, huge pattern for me to look at. In maturing myself, or in doing what Dr. Brown calls growing myself up, I get to ask, how well do I stay with the chosen course of clearly defining myself in my relationships in a new way? And never doubt that the old familiar patterns and ways of defaulting to will show up and seem very seductive, incredibly tempting. Why? Because they're familiar, and with familiarity, we associate comfort. So certainly for me, those patterns only knock at the door of my consciousness, and I recognize them very much as coming to undermine my ever-evolving, individuated, differentiated self. And those patterns were my tendency in the past to distance, to go into avoidance, to go along in order to get along. And all of those patterns, as you likely know, just shut down my high self, my true self, my Christ self. And so how to keep that Christ self, that high self, on the scene. And here we come to this week's key concepts. We're going to talk about those moments in the past in relationship, and maybe some of us still do it some of the time. I know I surely do. We're going to talk about giving up self, or the borrowing of self, and how that looks as opposed to owning self in relationship. Well, first, let's be on the lookout for what happens when I give up or borrow self. That happens when I revert to being a chameleon in any relationship that I think is important. Why? Because of fear of conflict, because of fear of upsetting what feels like a comfortable pattern. And that chameleon usurps my Christhood, in a sense. It can never really do that, but I'm giving that chameleon the power to seem like it's doing that. And then I come from my shadow or my ego, and I fit into whatever the environment seems to be demanding of me, rather than bringing my values, my integrity, my connection to the greatest power in me, and owning those values by clearly stating a position that especially could trigger someone else. So when we are conscious of being like a branch that wants to stay healthy, alive, growing, connected to the vine, which is the Christ, empowered by the husbandman, which is the source, then through that power, which we said is love, light, through that power, we can express our positions calmly. So whenever I allow others to fill my gaps because of my immaturity, because of the small stunted self, which just isn't ready to stand and own my positions informed by my values, then I really give up self entirely. The concepts that we only referenced and did not look at in depth last week have to do with what we're really aspiring to in these relationships. We are looking for mature connection, and we are vigilant that that connection does not become exaggerated. Okay? So connection in relationship can either present as mature, or it is at risk of becoming exaggerated as a connection, depending on the degree of integrity of positioning that I'm confident enough to bring to it. So we're going to look more closely at those two polarities, engaging in mature connecting with others and engaging in exaggerated connection. And the other two concepts that are important to growing myself up are a mature kind of separateness. Okay, we attach a lot of really negative stuff to separation and separateness, but there is such a thing defined as mature separateness versus a kind of separateness in relationship that springs from anxiety. So I'm just going to spend a few moments now sharing with you from Dr. Brown's work what I think have been helpful to me. Some of them at this stage in our lives, we've already moved past understanding that, things like, well, we are connected in rich relationships when we enjoy some things in common, or we talk a lot about vibrating at the same frequency. But what about these? What about being actually curious and interested in different viewpoints with people we care about? What about showing up and being willing to really cooperate with warmth, with respect, in really practical ways? How about being able to have disagreements? And then what about following up with that by being willing to ask for time together at another moment when it isn't reactive, in order for each one of us to say what was important to us in that particular exchange that, quite frankly, seemed to go south. So we understand mature connection a little better. Again, it's all about connecting to source through the Christ and being that vibrant vine, that vibrant branch. Sorry. Okay, so exaggerated connection is something I really saw, and I just did my best last night to stay in a place of gratitude. I was supporting a family going through exaggerated connection. Some schools of thought call this particular way of relating fusion. And you remember last week we looked at the 4 agreements. Well, in exaggerated connection, everything is taken personally. Everything is reacted to either with attack, defense, hurt, and withdrawal. You recognize those, right? Like, I think probably those most of us have consciously looked at. But what about these more insidious ways of exaggerated connection, which is reading the other person's mind, completing their sentences? Some of you have heard me say in classes where we've studied together that for me, the height of insanity, like the ego is definitely on the scene if I ever think that I can know what you think. And I've come up with my own prayer around that. And I tell myself, Roz, on a good day, I am in charge of my thoughts. I can't possibly complete yours. And of course, the other thing that can happen in extreme or exaggerated connection or fusion is that we think more about what's at stake or critical, or we think through the ego, what's at risk about the relationship than about our own mandate, our own responsibility to show up with clarity. So that's the difference between mature connection and exaggerated connection, where we need the other person to agree when we're in exaggerated connection. Let's look now at the polarities of mature separateness in healthy relating and anxious, anxiety-ridden separateness. In a mature kind of separateness, we know that we can take responsibility for our own needs in the relationship. We also know that we have committed to growing through our relationships. And so we do not look to the other person to solve any problems or to calm our anxiety. We recognize that's on our docket. And so sometimes in moments of tension with people that we love, it is very difficult to access our frontal lobe and just ask for some space, some privacy, some time, and some self-respect is in order as you temporarily separate in a mature way, willing to come back. Always to stay connected, no matter how uncomfortable it might appear. When we lapse into a kind of separateness that is driven by anxiety, by panic, by lack of God power, then we tend to go through periods of withdrawing from a relationship because we believe that the togetherness has been broken. Again, this family that I was supporting last night, I was willing to do that on a Saturday night because in having been in their lives for many years, I heard that they were ready to leave exaggerated connection and to define and state their values in a position with their 42-year-old son, who continues to carry the albatross of sibling rivalry into his life. And so let's look at that kind of separateness, a couple of more, what will we call them? I guess defining triggers. We know that we have separated in an anxious way when we just shut up. We stay silent on an issue that actually is important to our values, but we're more afraid of conflict than we are invested in stating our position. You know, a huge part of my awakening around this was the story that I used to tell myself about my family of origin, which was, oh my God, how did I choose this family? I was so invisible. They never saw me. They never got me. They never heard me. And then I awakened to the reality that how could they see me, value me, if I did not show up with my position, with my voice. And so the Kool-Aid that we drink when we're in immature separateness is that we believe that we can actually only be safe and happy by stopping all contact. Most of you know that one of my brothers separated that way for 10 years and still has looked at that as remorseful as opposed to how I see it, which was part of growing. I suppose the most insidious form of separation when we distance, or like I've said, I would go into avoidance, is that we do that without expressing clear reasons. Do we value this person in our lives? Well, do we value ourselves? Can we actually express our reasons for the decision to distance? And then perhaps the last of these is when we end up through guilt or a sense of obligation, what I call reluctant duty to make contact. And of course, in Unity, we call that shoulding on ourselves. I really should do this. Really, how about if I should just figure out who I am, get in touch with the source, with the Christ, which is the vine of the branch that I'm seeking to grow and experience. And so to bring today's immersion in these principles to a close, I noticed that this text, Growing Yourself Up, closes with about 15 guiding principles. If you'd like all of those, I'm certainly willing to send you a picture of it or whatever. I went through and sorted for what I thought were just a few of them that really might speak to where, as truth students who've been on this path for many, many years, for some of us, we have already worked on. But here are some of the guiding principles. Guiding principles for what? Well, for becoming relationally mature, for becoming a healthy, differentiated adult. And we do this by clarifying what our guiding principles are. For years and years, I've just called these my values. I do an inventory of these values. What are my top 3 values in order of priority? And that helps me find my position in any relationship. And so here's the few that I would like to share this morning. I am committed to not expressing myself in a relationship without first calming intense reactivity of my emotions to a level that allows me to think. I am, secondly, committed to sticking to what I'm responsible for and not taking responsibility for what is in another's area, not impinging, in other words, on another person's functioning. I am hereby committed to thinking, feeling, speaking, and behaving on behalf of myself and not on behalf of another. I find that the more I practice this, the more I notice when someone is reactive and referring to themselves as you, if you know what I mean. That's total abandonment of self. You, when you do this, you do that. Okay, so when I commit to thinking, feeling, speaking, and behaving on behalf of my integrated self, for me, that the scripture I often awaken with in the morning speaks to this, which is, I take every thought, word, and deed captive for the Christ within. These get a little tougher, these last 2. I hereby commit to being as aware of the other person's interests as my own, and I will do my best to behave in ways that do not impair or impede the growth of another. This is a good one coming from a recovered control freak. I am committed to putting my energy into what is within my own control and not trying to change what is only in others' control. Finally, I'm committed to focusing on the part I am contributing in any relationship challenge. And folks, this leads into 3 or 4 steps of how to apply this, because Dr. Brown writes, I'm contributing to this challenge, and can I focus on what I'm creating or contributing to the challenge, as opposed to getting stuck in critiquing or changing the other person. I will ask myself a question like this. So what is the other person up against having to relate with me right now about this? Deep breath in. That's a lot of stuff to ingest, digest, integrate, and apply. And I don't think it's an accident that 4 or 5 years ago, just in perfect harmony with my discovering this work of a mature individuated self, I also came across the global ministry, is how I think of Dr. Marshall Rosenberg's work, his school of thought based on nonviolent communication. Some of you were at the workshop that I gave before being hired in Rochester, and so maybe some of this will ring a bell. I'm only just going to mention it because I like to go into my week after a unity lesson with something very specific, practical, and applicable. It is impossible. I have tried in 2 hours. I have tried in a weekend. It is impossible to do really a good job of Dr. Marshall Rosenberg's work on how to show up in relationship in a way that allows for loving communication. However, I will quickly share with you his 4 steps. He has used these in every part of the world, in communist countries, in war-torn countries, in Africa, and it's just amazing if you've ever watched him at work. He has gone on to his next experience of living. However, the 4 steps that he outlines will always work are: number 1, when you're in a situation, in a relationship that feels difficult or challenging, the first thing to do is to come up with an observation about it, as opposed to a judgment, a critique, a perception. I can tell you that of the 4 steps, that for me is clearly the most challenging, because as he teaches, we are very, very much in love with our analysis of a situation. And the only thing we perhaps, are hypnotized by more than analysis are our perceptions and judgments. And so in coming up with an observation, and I'll do an example in closing, but we must communicate clearly just the facts that we are observing. Now we go back to the explorer from our inspirational reading. An observation is simply, these are the facts that I see, devoid of judgment. The second step is hard for a lot of people. All the years that I've been teaching the scale of emotions, I still notice people's extreme discomfort with accessing a feeling. My youngest brother has been seeking a statement of feeling from the one daughter he hopes to maintain relationship with, and he is amazed now that he's listening for a feeling, how he gets anything but a raw feeling. So this is a whole, as you know, a whole school of thought just to get in touch with what is a real feeling and not what Marshall calls a fake feeling. So make an observation, express a feeling. Here's the next one. This one's still really hard for some of us. Just make a statement of what your need is in the situation. What is my need? Again, this has to do with positioning, with maturity, with resilience. Why? Why is resilience so important in maturity? well, so that I can stand in the energy of the other person losing their stuff and still express what is true in the situation with my best at this time. After I have managed to express a need in a healthy way, then I make a request. And here's the best part about making a request. I must be prepared to hear a no. And I can tell you that as many times as I have heard a no, it is still somewhat uncomfortable, surprising, and important for me to practice with. Let's take a deep breath as we close this part of our Sunday morning gathering, this part of the lesson, and I ask Spirit to speak forth an example of nonviolent communication that I have recently used or could use in this moment. So let's use the wonderful example of being texted by my brother that I need to show up in Chatham, where he's chosen to live with my dad and brother, that I need to go there once a week. So as an observation, I would likely say something like this, and this is not prepared. I noticed in your text last night that you believe it would be good for me to come to Chatham once a week? ? Just observing. That's what I noticed in your text. I feel really frustrated, angry, and frankly, sad. That's how I feel in response to that. I have a need to be seen. I have a need to be understood. I have a need to be valued as a person who serves the ministry and does not just nilly-willy take off for a day every week. And that's important for me to have that need met. Would you be willing to think about my feeling and my need in this and then leave it with them to dictate how the conversation goes? Stretching and growing are painful. They were never designed to be a walk in the park. And so as we prepare for meditation, I just encourage you to turn within. For me, the scriptural imagery of the Father as the keeper of the vineyard, the Christ of me as the vine, and my high self as part of that vine, consciously connected to that vine. That beautiful image of a vineyard, the husbandman who cares for it, maintains it, sustains it, plants it, protects it, all those resources. That is the Father within me. The Christ of me is the vine. And through my branchhood, my high selfhood, I am one with that Christ and thereby one with the Father.